J.B. Livingston, taking place in Houston, Texas, on March the 8th, 1996. The interviewer is Dr. Vernon L. Williams of the Department of History at Abilene Christian University. J.B., is it all right for me to call you J.B.?
Yes, it is.
If you would you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, who your parents were, and a little bit about your family background?
Well, of course, I was born in 1920, and at that time, my family lived on a farm about 3 miles out of a town called Livingston, South Carolina. And I lived there until I was about 15, in which at that time we moved to a little village called Woodford, South Carolina, where I went to high school from there at a little town about 4 miles away from Woodford called North South Carolina. And that's where I graduated from high school. I spent a year after high school working on the farm with my father and the rest of the family. I had 4 brothers and 1 sister. My father was named Talmadge Livingston, and he was raised on the farm that I was born on. My mother's name was Rebecca Livingston, so I was a Livingston for both sides. And we lived on a farm throughout my life until when I was 18, I guess. I went to Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which at that time was a men's Methodist school college, a liberal arts college. And there, while I was in Wofford, I took ROTC training. So consequently, in 1941, when the war broke out, the day the war broke out, I was working in the mess hall of Carlisle Dormitory in Wofford, at Wofford. And I was serving the noon meal at the time we heard about the war breaking out in Pearl Harbor. So, but my class, which I was a senior I was not a senior that year, but we were able to go to summer camp during the summer, and then we graduated in 1942. And being in ROTC, we graduated with a second lieutenant commission. Consequently, that meant we immediately went into the war service. The first place I was assigned was at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the armored part of the Army. Fort Knox was the center of all the armored service activities in schools and so forth. We spent 2 months there in training, which was essentially what our only officer training that we had, other than what we had while we were at Wofford. From there, we went to maneuvers in California, in the desert in California. At the time, Patton was out there also training. Spent 2 months out there, and then we were assigned to the 12th Armored Division, which was being activated at Camp Camel, Kentucky, which was what it was called at that time. So after we got through with the 2 months maneuvers in California, which we got some experience, some good field experience in the tanks. From there we went to Fort Campbell and joined the 12th Armored Division.
Before we go on and take a look at your entry into the division, you tell me a little bit about the training at Fort Knox. Was it essentially a sort of an officer orientation kind of a course? What kinds of things did you do? Classes and that kind of thing?
Well, yes, it was called Officers Orientation Course for officers like myself who come out of ROT schools. And during the training, we were exposed to arms extensively. We took the training in rifles, machine guns, tank guns, and guns of all types. We also had exposure to maintenance school service, because being in tanks, we had a lot of maintenance to keep up with it, and as officers, we were supposed to know as much about that as anybody, I guess. But we had a lot of training in maintenance, and we also had training in activities involving the actual application of troops in the field. The problems, we did quite a number of problems in the field, which we were exposed to how officers should operate in administrative parts of the service also. And it was, as far as I'm concerned, it was an excellent course that we needed. And we came out of there pretty well prepared to go to the field and put our training into action.
What about maneuvers? Did the men that you trained with at Fort Knox go with you in mass? In other words, were you with people you knew?
No, actually, we were assigned to our outfits that we would eventually report to before we left Fort Knox. So consequently, each man there, we were in a class of about 50 officers. And of those 50, I went to the 12th Armored Division, and I believe there was about 3 other officers in training with me that went to the 12th Armored also. So I know one went to artillery, one went to ordnance battalions, and I think I was the only one that I can recall that actually went to a tank battalion, which is where I was assigned when I got to the 12th Armored.
Which battalion?
I was assigned to the 43rd Armored Regiment at that time, and later it was divided up into battalions and ended up in the 43rd Armored Battalion, or 43rd Tank Battalion, I believe it's usually called.
What about the maneuvers before you get to Campbell? Can you tell us a little more about the kinds of things you learned? After all, you're only about 2 months out of college. Must have been different for you.
Yes, it was. But being raised on a farm, I was used to a lot of hours during the day involved in activities, and it was certainly like that when we got on maneuvers, because we joined our outfits that we were assigned to for the maneuvers while they were in the middle of a project or a problem, we called it. And that meant that everybody was out in a position on an active problem that was taking place, which I got to a tank one night about midnight, and that was where I was going to spend the next 2 months. And everybody was dirty, covered with dust, because the desert in California is an arid desert, and it gets cold at night and extremely hot during the day, so you had a wide variance of temperature, and the dust was just extensive. When you traveled in those tanks, it kicked up a lot of dust, and as far as maintenance was concerned, about the most important part of our maintenance was keeping the what we call them air cleaners cleaned out.
What was that?
And the air cleaners, where the air goes into the engine, it goes through this air cleaner, and it was had oil in the bottom of them, and the dust would collect 2 inches deep in those air cleaners in just a few hours of travel out there in the desert. So we had to clean those things pretty often.
What would you do? Would you have to do you have to change the oil in that filter?
Oh yes, we'd change the oil in it. We poured all the dust out of it, and then put new oil in and put it back in place. But there was, of course, a usual maintenance. We had to take had to do every night. We'd be traveling, doing the activities during the day, and then we usually stop at night. And that's when we had to do our maintenance and get a little something to eat and so forth. But we did do some night maneuvering also. But it was a good experience. At the time, I was in a light tank, which is the smallest tank the Army had. And that differed from when I got to the 12th Romber Division. We were in medium tanks, which was a little bit larger vehicle. And we were exposed to tactical problems, administrative, or actual being responsible for what we did during the problems, as well as we were exposed to the handling the men, looking after their welfare, and just everything that we were trained to do before we got there. And it was an immeasurable experience as far as I'm concerned, because when we got to our home outfit, as we called them, we were pretty well prepared to go.
When you think back to the days later, the months that you were in combat, did you experience any of the same kinds of problems you did on the desert? In other words, did that experience help you at all in your operations in France and Germany?
Well, yes, it was a great help to what we were exposed to in Europe. The main difference from that experience and the one we had in the desert was that the climate was much different. Of course, in Europe, you don't have deserts. There's a lot of rain and snow in the wintertime, and where in California we didn't see a shower of rain more than just enough to wet the ground in the whole 3 months, 2 months we were out there. The exposure to handling personnel during combat was the training we had before that was real help, because we were exposed to some of the things that took place on maneuvers. The same things or similar things were happening in combat. And I would say that our maneuver experience was very helpful to what the experiences we had in Europe during combat. And then, of course, the same thing would apply when we're not in active combat. Why, we had a lot of things to do that we had been exposed to during maneuvers in California. But now, we had another maneuver with the 12th. The 12th went on maneuvers in Tennessee for 2 months. And those maneuvers were more like conditions, I would say, than the desert was as far as Europe's activity was concerned. But again, we went through the same types of things that we were exposed to in combat. So it was all very helpful. The maneuvers, I thought, was really a good way to train us during our training period.
Let's pick up the story at Camp Campbell, your arrival there. What do you remember about that first day, if anything?
Well, in our transfer to Camp Campbell, of course, I'd just been married. I got married in August, the 21st of August, and 2 weeks from the time when we were married, we were sent on maneuvers in Tennessee. So my honeymoon didn't last very long.
Well,
but
you told me that you had married an Abilene girl. How in the world did you find an Abilene girl before you ever came to Abilene?
Well, that little experience is kind of interesting as far as I'm concerned. When we left Fort Knox, after our officers' orientation training there, 2 guys and myself went together from Fort Knox to California maneuvers. I'm sorry I can't remember the guys' names. One was from Tennessee and the other one lived in Louisville, Kentucky. And the guy from Tennessee had a forward single-seated coupe, I guess 41 model, I think. But anyway, the three of us started out from Fort Knox. Well, actually, we started out from Louisville, Kentucky. This one guy's home. We spent the night with him before we left. And we took off and drove as far as Texarkana, Arkansas, the first day, or before we stopped. We got in there about late in the afternoon, and of course, young as we were, while we were looking for some fun for the night, and we did find some girls, and actually we only found one girl, and so with the other two guys, we stayed around there until the third guy went out with this girl that night, and he came back in, and we took off about 11 o'clock that night, driving west. And the next day about noon, we arrived in Abilene. And it's about noon, yes, we were there. They were sitting in a drugstore, and one of the guys had been down the street to a military store, and he came in and joined us for a sandwich there in the drugstore, and we were talking about there were a lot of girls in Abilene, nice looking girls. So we were talking about that, and this guy came in, and we were talking, and he said, well, you should see that girl down at the military store. So when we got through eating our sandwich, we went down, and sure enough, see, we saw this girl he was talking about, and she was a nice looking girl. So they had a little inner pool table and a ping pong table in the back of the store, and the servicemen would come in there and they'd, have something to do. So we stayed around there. Well, immediately we asked her to go out on a date with us that night. And we told her, we got acquainted, and we told her that we would spend the night in Abilene if she would go out with us and find us 2 more dates. So we didn't want to deal with what had the night before, where the two of us would have to twiddle our thumbs while the other guy had the fun. So anyway, she didn't like that idea. So we decided we'd stay a little longer and play some more ping pong. And anyway, make a long story short, about, I would say, probably 5 or 6 o'clock, she finally decided, well, okay. She'd been around us for several hours. And thought it might not be too bad a deal, so she called up 2 other girls, and we all 6 went out that night. And we had a lot of fun. They had a nightclub place there in Abilene, and which you danced a little bit, and I'd never danced in my life before. And she was an excellent dancer. The girl I'm talking about was who I married.
What was her name?
Her name was Laureen Hayes, and she was in high school. And anyway, after we got us a room at the hotel that afternoon, when she decided she gives us some dates for that night. So when we went out, we came back in about 11 o'clock, and of course they were high school girls and didn't need to get in pretty early. But we had a lot of fun that night, and when we got back to the hotel, I told them I had one other thing about this deal. The night before, I think we drew straws on who was going to go out with the girl. And this night we said, well, we'll let this girl pick who she was going to go out with, and the other 2 would take whoever she got for us. So anyway, we picked up one girl, and she said, this is your date, and then went to get another girl, and said, this is your date, and so, well, it looks like I'm going to have her for a date. So anyway, we had a fun, like I said. We came back to the hotel, and I said, boys, fellas, I'm going to marry that girl. And I did.
Did she know about the plan yet?
No, she didn't know that. But we spent the night, got a good night's rest. and got in the car, took off the next morning. And during this 2 months in the, while we were on maneuvers, why she wrote to me and I wrote to her several times during that couple of months. And when we were sent on our way back to our assigned outfits, and I was going back to Campbell, Kentucky, I stopped in Abilene. And you know, she was still there. She had been out to California. Her parents worked. Her father was working out at Ventura, California, in the Navy, and she went out during that 2 months. She would travel to California, but she had gone back to Abilene and was going back to school there. So I actually took about a week's leave and spent it in Abilene. And when I left, the morning I left to come back, to go on to Fort Campbell, she met me at the depot to get her on the train, and I give her an engagement ring. So we decided to get married the night before. So I gave her the engagement ring and got on the train and took off. And during the next year, that would have been in about October of '42. During the next year, we wrote extensively and talked on the phone a time or two, and she came to see me in Campbell in early part of August of '43. And at that time, we were still just engaged. But before she left to go back home, we had decided to get married, and we were married, as I say, on the 21st of August of '43. And we had 2 weeks together before we went on maneuvers in Tennessee.
What did her parents think about all this?
Oh, they didn't like it at all.
Did you ever win them over?
Yeah. Yes, I had no problem with them, but the thing that they really didn't like about it, and it was unfair for them, when she came to see me in Tennessee, Kentucky, you know, the Tennessee-Kentucky line ran right through Fort Campbell, so some guys would leave in Kentucky and go to work in Tennessee, so we sometimes called it Campbell, Tennessee, and Campbell, Kentucky. But she didn't tell her parents that what she was doing, unfortunately. I say unfortunately now, but it turned out okay. And of course they didn't appreciate her going to Tennessee and getting married without letting them know it. But the first time I saw her parents was when we were transferred to Abilene, and I had no problem in winning them over, and we had an excellent relation until they passed away in the last 10 or 20 years, I guess. They've been gone.
Before we leave Abilene, do you remember the names of any of the places? For example, the night at Charlie Blank's.
Yes. Charlie Blank's was a club that we went to the night we first hit Abilene. Yes.
And do you remember what hotel you stayed in?
At the Newton.
At the Newton.
Newton Hotel. Yeah. It was a real nice hotel. It was fairly new at the time, and it was a real nice hotel. And of course, places to live in California during that time were really, really scarce. But my wife was always able to find something nice to live in. If it was nothing but a room in a home that the owners of the home were not there and they wanted somebody to take care of the home, which is the case. The first place we lived there was that time. And then she wanted us rented what we called a garage apartment, which was an apartment built above somebody's garage, and it was real nice. So she was a real nice girl, and We had 49 years.
Well, it was a good thing you all didn't go through Amarillo on the way out to California and missed Abilene, wasn't it?
That's right.
Well, tell me a little bit about the 12th Armored Division when you first report. Any people you remember, officers in the 43rd that you encounter in those first days who later became colleagues and friends that you remember?
Yes, at the time that I reported to the 12th Armored, it was getting pretty well along being organized. They did not have the full complement of troops. The officers were not complete either, but they filled up fast. So consequently, there were some officers there. Most of the cadre was there at the time, but as they came in, we got acquainted. There were people from A&M school in Texas, from Mississippi colleges. Well, all the colleges across the South that had ROTC units were that's where most of the guys came from. There was some that came from officers training in the service itself. But we got acquainted with each other pretty fast and established some good camaraderie. And the one particular guy that I got acquainted with was named Wayne Gateau. He was from New York, and he was our best man.
What do you remember about him?
Well, he was a tall feller, about I would say around 6 foot tall, and very, very nice guy. He's easygoing, never raised his voice. He was there's a lot of people you can say what a bachelor is really what he was. But he was moved from our company, which was B Company, over to 23rd Battalion, one of the companies over there. And that particular guy, I knew him and saw him very often, but he got killed.
Do you remember where?
In the Herlesheim operation. Actually, his company relieved my company, and he was out of his tank and got hit by a sniper. He had 2 tanks knocked out with his activities in the war before that, but he was, unfortunately, he didn't last very long. He was killed almost instantly.
What was his job in the 43rd when he was still with you?
He was a platoon leader, and he was still a platoon leader when he got killed. He was first lieutenant when he got killed, but he was still a platoon and an excellent platoon leader.
Were you still a second lieutenant by the time you get to Campbell?
Well, when I got to Campbell, yes. But when we left Campbell, I was first lieutenant, and I was the maintenance officer. During all the time our training in Fort Campbell, or Camp Campbell at that time, I was the maintenance officer for B Company, and I believe executive officer with the company. And I still had that classification and that duties until we were in combat. And at the Herlesheim experience, we lost all of in my company, we lost all the tanks except 5, and of course we lost the company commander and all the officers except myself. So I became company commander that way. And but the other officers that I was acquainted with was one was named Scotty. Leon Scott was his name, and he was with me until he got wounded at an early time and had to go back to the hospital. He lost an eye there. He got hit in the corner of his eye with a sniper shot. So he was sent home at that time, and I still remained in touch with him throughout his life. He died of a heart attack, I believe, I believe it's been about 10 or 12 years ago now.
Where was he from?
He came back from, he was from Muncie, Indiana, and he was in the school teaching business there. And he came back and got his job back from teaching school and became the principal of the school. And he was involved in politics and in Muncie, and he was just a nice guy. And they'd always take a trip during the summer, and they always came by to see me where I was. Yeah, I lived in Lubbock and Midland, and Odessa, in West Texas, and he'd always come by to see me. And then since I moved to Houston, he came by several times. Unfortunately, I didn't do much traveling myself, but he did, and they liked to travel, and he'd always come by, and we'd have 2 or 3 days together.
Well, tell me a little bit about the maneuvers in Tennessee, and let's take a look at the training phase in more or less chronological order before you head out to Texas and Barkley. You all spend some time in the Tennessee maneuvers. What was that like?
Well, to begin with, we landed in Tennessee in a beautiful meadow alongside the highway on a Saturday afternoon. And we were out there in the middle of the meadow grass, you know. The grass was pretty and green, and softball was our activities when we're not busy. And I liked to play baseball. So I was out there with the men, and several other officers were out there. We were joining them in the activities, and I had been up to bat and went around the bases and came back, and there was down the third base line, there was a group of men sitting on the grass. And I walked down there and sat down right in the middle of them. It was 5 or 6 guys on one side and the same number on the other side. And one of the cooks was up to the bat. And he swung that bat and turned it loose. And he really swung at the ball. But he missed the ball and turned the bat loose, and somebody said, "Look out." And about that time, I was looking kind of like this, and somebody said, "Look out." So I looked that way, and that bat hit me right in the mouth. That's why I've got this scar here. And my experience from that point on was that cook, he really took care of me. I couldn't chew anything for several weeks, but I got real good service out of that kitchen. But as far as other activities during Tennessee maneuvers, what principally involved field activities, or field problems we called it, which involved all types of training that we had been trained in, which and my job as maintenance officer was to keep all the supplies coming and all the maintenance work done, and see that the vehicles were ready to go, and keep the company commander informed to the condition of the vehicles and those that were not operable, and I mean, we had ready and so forth. So I didn't have a whole lot of duties as far as the tactics were concerned. However, I was still trained in them, and I was prepared to take a platoon leader's job or somebody else's if that became necessary. But my job was less from a tactical standpoint than the platoon leaders were. But the activities that the company did during that time was, of course, operating with the battalion and the division and so forth, and we were every day on some type of operation. We spent some time on the firing ranges, getting experience in firing the weapon and so forth, but a lot of the time we were spent on tactical problems and the things involved with that, which is what you do when you go to war. You just use your training in whatever comes up. The weather was, as I recall, was pretty good. We had some wet weather. We had a river crossing problem, and the terrains and the weather and so forth was I would say somewhat similar to that we experienced in Europe. It was different from what we had in the desert, but there was not much going on in the desert in those days, and we were preparing to go to Europe proper.
Any NCO enlisted personnel that stands out in your mind that worked for you or under you?
Oh yes, I've had one sergeant that was maintenance sergeant. He was a tech sergeant in grade, and he was the NCO that was in charge of the maintenance crew. We had a crew of it varied from time, but we had a group of 10 or 15 mechanics and supply people and so forth in our maintenance section. And this sergeant was named Tyler. I can't recall his first, but he saved me and trained me because he was an experienced person in life, and
about how old was he at that time? Much
he
older
was
than
in
you?
his 30s. Of course, I was an old man at that time, as far as we were concerned. I was only, see, I was only 24 years old when I went overseas. And to have somebody 30, 32 years old that was a good person was an asset indeed. But he took care of that crew too. Him, and he didn't only just look after me, but he did look after me.
Did you ever contact him after the war? You know what happened to him?
No, well, I didn't, because he lived in Long Island, New York, and I didn't do any traveling. I had Christmas card too, but other than that, we never did see each other. The other guy was the first sergeant, Andy McGuire. And he was a number one first sergeant, and I have seen him a number of times since at conventions or talked to him and got Christmas cards from him. And there was another what was called platoon sergeant. I can't think of his name right now, but he was a great guy, and he was always sending everybody Christmas cards afterwards. In our company, we had excellent camaraderie, and everybody looked after everybody else, and I'm sure that existed in all companies. Hopefully it did. But we got along real well. We knew everybody and knew what they were doing, and what they needed and so forth. And when we were called on to do something, we had the guys trained and ready and did it.
What about the movement back to Campbell? How long were you there before the division moved to Texas?
You mean from maneuvers?
Yes, after you finished maneuvers and went back to Campbell.
We went to Tennessee maneuvers, and we didn't see Campbell anymore. We went from Tennessee maneuvers. I was chosen on the advanced crew to go to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, and pick up vehicles. And that was everything, I believe, except the tanks. I think they were moved by rail, but all the trucks and those smaller vehicles we drove from Chaffee, Arkansas to Abilene.
So in a convoy?
In a convoy on the highways. And we drove all day and spent the night in Arlington, Texas, in the old fairgrounds there, and then we drove one to Abilene the next day. But that's about the extent of what took place in the movement from Tennessee, because we left our vehicles in Tennessee and somebody else came in and took them over. So we had to get new equipment who somebody else had left it for. I think they left it at Chaffee, and I was all shipped down there at Abilene. I think we were the first division to go to Berkeley in Abilene.
There were several infantry divisions that were there before.
The medics training segment, and maybe an infantry division. Yes, there was an infantry division went there before us, but I believe we were the first tanks to go there.
What did you find? What do you remember about that day when you all pulled in? What did you find in the way of company areas and that kind of thing, housing?
Well, it was it was something that we really hadn't experienced before, because there was no trees anywhere. There were some streets laid out, and some fabricated huts for barracks, and there wasn't anything that looked like the comforts of home at all. But we made it okay. We got when we got to our area, of course, like I say, the barracks that we had were fabricated being they were built with plywood board siding, stuff like that. They did have some windows in them, and everything on the camp was built out of that type of material. Maybe the mess hall was made out of regular lumber, but then there was a lot of training grounds, and the motor pools and everything like that were some types of terrain is good for that type of activity, because you didn't have to worry about rain. There was not a lot of mud, but when it did rain in that area, the mud was terrible. The vehicles would just bog out of sight when we really got wet. I mean, it didn't do that very often, but occasionally it did. So, having moved around already some while we were expecting anything, and we made do with what we got.
What do you remember about training there? How long was it before the rest of the unit arrived?
Well, they were arriving every day. Some of them had some of the people had gotten there before we did. But all of them, they came in pretty fast. Of course, there's some that I haven't thought about in years, and I can't remember exactly what all happened, but as I recall, the weather and everything at Abilene was not disagreeable, meaning that like I said, we didn't have a whole lot of rain. It's always easier to operate when you're not having rain going down your neck. The ground was hard. Didn't have a whole lot of problems getting vehicles around. There was a lot of cleaching in that country that was used to put on the roadways, and there was a very good material to put on roadways to maintain stability and so forth. It was just a new home, and we made do with what it was.
As an officer, how did your housing arrangements, having your wife, of course, there with you since that was her hometown, how did that work out in terms of operations? Was there a problem in getting home at night?
Well, no, we used a car. Somebody usually had a car, and there were people who were married, who were married as I was, and their wives, and my wife had found a place to live beforehand, and we kind of carpooled into town and back every day. There was a lot of days that we didn't go in. A lot of days during this time we were out in the field on tactical problems. I mean, we start out sometime on Monday morning and while we were in Abilene, and not be back in the camp until maybe Friday or Saturday. Sometimes we'd be out weekend. Now that took a lot of our time. During the time I was in Abilene, I went to a 1 month what was called gunnery school in Fort Knox, and that was there we went again over all the guns, updated on newer. We were getting newer tanks, and we were going from 75 millimeter to 76 millimeter main guns and so forth. So periodically somebody would go in and get schooled up on the late equipment, and then came back and instructed personnel on these things. Also, during that, let's see, we were in Abilene about 9 months, I guess, altogether. And during that time, so I went to a maintenance school, which was a 3 month deal. We studied those tanks from one end to the other. I mean, everything that was on them, from tracks to rear wheels, and differentials, and powertrains, and armor plating, and everything about that tank we knew from one end to the other before we went back home from that, which it prepared us. It's all of our maintenance personnel went to those schools also.
Where was the maintenance school located? It's
in Fort Knox. All armored training at that time was done in Fort Knox, and that was considered armored training. And during that time, my wife moved to a little town between Fort Knox and Louisville on the river. And so I was lucky enough there that I got some other guys were going that way during the day, and I'd ride with them and ride back in. We weren't supposed to be married and going to that school, but I was, and I got to see my wife nearly every night while I was in those schools. So that wasn't too bad. I had experience while I was in at school that historically I'd had a lot of problems with tonsils, and I still had my tonsils, and I got a big case of tonsillitis there one day, and went down to the infirmary, and they kind of give me an aspirin or so, and they did take a swab of my throat. And in my experience had been, like you go doctor yourself if you can. So I got me a bottle of peroxide and started goggling with peroxide, and in about a day or so, I was okay. And because I had done this before, but about 3 days later, they came from the dispensary and got me out of class and took me back down to the dispensary, and they said, "Man, you're sick." And they wanted to put me in the hospital. I said, "No, Doc, I'm okay now." So he took a look and said, "Yeah, sure are." So we'll go back to class. So anyway, we had some funny things happen there once in a while.
What do you remember about the pullout? Well, before we get to that, Mrs. Miggs, Colonel Miggs's widow, told me a couple of years ago that General Brewer was very much opposed to having officers' wives there, or I guess any wives for that matter, that this was no place for them, that it interfered with training and so on. Did you ever encounter any attitude like that?
Well, yes, the one time at the school I mentioned that the wives were not supposed to be there, but nobody ever got in any major trouble on account of it, because we didn't let it interfere, because you were supposed to be there for training on a certain time in the morning, and if you hadn't been, I guess it would have been some problem. But there was that existed. But fortunately, I never was really involved in anything of any that turned out to be a problem.
At Barclay, you didn't experience any kind of problems with that?
No, because, I got our company officers, if your company commander's got his wife that lives in town and he wants to go see her every night, why, then that kind of makes it a little bit easier for everybody else, And actually, I think what we did, as I recall, it was never a problem, because we were there on time when we were supposed to be. And if we hadn't been, well, we might have been a problem.
What do you remember about the packing up and pulling out for Europe, the trip as well? Tell us a little bit about that whole thing.
Well, of course, when we got the word that we were going to go someplace, we didn't know where. Everybody did get high behind packing. And we packed our personal equipment as well as the vehicles and that. But and I can't remember now that you mentioned that, we seemed to me like that we put a lot of vehicles on that train. We had to pack everything a certain way, and we had instructions on how to do all those kind of things, and put it on the train to be shipped out. But we didn't get that equipment, because when we got to Europe, we got absolutely brand new tanks and vehicles. They were still in codmoline. We had to get the codmoline off the guns and everything in order for them to function, and then we had to take them down to the southern shores of England there and practice out in the ocean. So I don't know where those vehicles went. But as far as personnel is concerned, why, we were instructed on how to do everything and pack it, and when we had to be ready. And we had a duffel bag, and that was about it as far as containers for your personal property. We did have officers had foot lockers. And at that time, I believe those foot lockers were shipped with us. But we put them someplace, and then somebody took them there. But to take along with us, we just had a duffel bag. Everything we wanted to take was in that. And I don't remember whether we took a gun with us from Abilene or not. But I don't believe we did. I can't remember for sure. But anyway, it was just something that people had learned to accept and did the best they could. And as far as the person, your wife is concerned, why, we were restricted several days before we left. We couldn't see them. And of course, we didn't know where we were going, and we couldn't tell them where we were going either, because we didn't know, so we couldn't tell them. So it was 2 or 3 days before we left that we really didn't see them. Couldn't call them on the phone or anything else. Phone service at that time is not like it is today, by a long shot, because there wasn't as many phones in the first place, and cellular phones were not in existence. So today, my daughters and their families, they all carry a cellular phone around in a purse, and if they want to call somebody, no matter where it is, they can do it. Just sitting right here. But we didn't have that kind of communications at that time. But there was nothing outstanding that happened that I can recall.
Well, so did you see your wife before you left in that 3-day period?
No. It was at least 2 days before we left. They said, this is the last time you're going to see him. And that was.
What about the train trip? Did you all, your unit, go to Camp Shanks?
Yeah. We went to Camp Shanks, and we got on that train and left out of Barclay. That's where we left from. And never having been on a troop train before, everybody had heard about him, and it was an experience. But it wasn't too bad. I mean, they'd stop every once in a while. You could get off and rest a little bit, and they'd serve chow 2 or 3 times a day, which meant you stopped, and the kitchen was in one car, and they'd serve a meal, and everybody would pack up and get back on the train and take off again. And it took us, oh gosh, I can't remember. It took us 4 or 5 days to get from Barclay to Camp Shanks. And we got in there in the middle of the night. There were barracks and everything for us to stay in, and we still didn't know where we were going to go when we got on a boat. We just were told we were going to get on a boat sometime and go somewhere. So anyway, when we got into Shanks, well, I don't think we were there more than 2 or 3 days, and we were allowed to go into New York City one evening, which I enjoyed. I'd never been in New York, never been there since, but I did enjoy the few hours we spent in. I was with some guys that had been there and were familiar with where it was, and we rode the subway, and saw a few things, a show or so, and we had a good evening, but there was really nothing bad about the experience that I can recall. It was just something that I didn't want to be doing, but I had to do it, so I just made the best of it.
One thing I failed to ask you back at Barclay, General Brewer and a number of other officers were relieved of their commands, and General Green came in. Do you remember anything about the circumstances around that, and how that filtered down to the 43rd?
Well, I think I know the incident you're talking about, and it took place when I was in maintenance school in Fort Knox. It took place while I was gone. And my understanding is what happened was that, when every unit is sent overseas for combat, they had to put them through a test of some type, which included I think everything that we had to do, from supplies to tactics, to how you maneuver during your tactical operations, and what you did and how it worked and how well the men seemed to be trained. And it's my understanding that we didn't pass. And that's when they relieved General Brewer, I believe. I know when I got back, this had just happened. and we went into extensive few weeks of training. And I guess somebody checked us again and said, "You're ready to go." And then I think I got back to the company like must have been in July or August, and the intense training was going on when I got there. And so we left. We got on a train and left Barclay September the 20th, as I recall. So sometime between the time they took that first test, which was sometime during the summer, and in September, we must have got ourselves in shape.
Were there any changes in the 43rd command structure as a result of this? Or was it did it remain the same, like battalion commander?
Well, no, I don't believe the 43rd Battalion at that time. See, we started out as a 43rd Regiment, armored regiment, and Brewer was our commander of that regiment. And he got promoted when they reorganized and broke the regiments up into battalions. Sometime along in the end, I got a promotion. He was a wing colonel at that time. But I don't believe that the 43rd actually had any command changes. Now, I don't know what the problem was, but there was something about the 12th Armored that they didn't think it was ready to go overseas. And that's when Brewer was relieved and General Green came in.
You have any personal experiences with either of those two men?
No, nothing other than just seeing them and speaking to them. No personal activities, no. No, and the only personal activities I had with any higher officers was an experience during combat. And were you wanting to give you that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, it was in March, I guess, of '45, and we'd been through the Hurlstein deal, and we'd been back in the rest area, and we'd been resupplied with equipment and personnel, and did some training of those. We were getting people from the States who had had very little training and were very young. I mean, they were getting teenagers, and they didn't know, had not had a chance to learn much about combat. So we did a little training with them, and as well as getting with our new equipment. But anyway, we had been looking at the front line, and our higher officers were telling us daily what was going on and what probably would happen to us. So we had a few little skirmishes, but then we were told to go up through Luxembourg. We got just the edge over there, and then we turned back going east towards the Rhine River. And we were going down a highway there that had lots of German animals, horses, carts and stuff that had been strafed by American planes or Allied planes alongside the highway. We passed along, and we had, I believe it was 5 piles of bombs that were probably the 500-pound equivalent. The piles of bombs was larger than this house, and along beside the road, and primer cord was wrapped all around these bombs, I'm sure with the intention of blowing those piles of bombs up as we passed by, but we passed right along beside them. And we had we saw one explosion on the far end of it, and we got down there, and somebody was looking after us, I guess. And the primer cord was set off, and it only went through the first batch, and probably cut itself off or something, but it was severed, and the charge never went on down through the piece, so we felt like we were lucky there. So anyway, we passed that up and went on down till we got to the Rhine River, and we turned south, which was going towards Switzerland that way. It seems backwards to me sometime when you say south, when we were actually going what would normally be north here in this country. But anyway, we went on down there. We passed through towns. So we hit the river somewhere around Worms, and we started. It was actually up the river, is what I'm trying to say. And we passed through several little towns, and we got through a town. I'll forget the name of it, but it was about 2 miles out of Luxembourg. In these towns, people were with weapons, waving white handkerchiefs and so forth as we passed through. So when we got into this little town, then we didn't see nobody on the street. So we said, well, this don't look right. So anyway, we went on down through the town, and I had my company of tanks on the road. We were the point head knockers on the road, and the street went in and made a 90-degree turn to go back toward Luxembourg, and this was real flat country. And we got, I think it was 3 tanks around that corner, and the Germans opened fire on us from Luxembourg. Ludwigshafen, not Luxembourg. Ludwigshafen is the name of the town. And it's right on the Rhine River. It's an industrial complex around there. Anyway, we saw the firing was coming from, and it was in the edge of the city of Ludwigshafen. And those 88 guns were stationary, and they would raise up out of the ground and shoot at you, and then they'd go back down. And we saw this was happening. So I told the guys, I said, now, you know, this looks like a suicide deal to me. So let's just get our normal procedures out here and scatter out on the edge of town here, and let's just see what's going to happen here. So anyway, I was operating under the Armored Infantry Battalion commander, and I think his name was Wells, but I'm not sure about that.
Clayton Wells?
I believe that's right. And we talked about it, and I told him what I could tell him, and he'd been looking also, and he said, well, let's see if we can get a hold of General Combat Commander, CCB, I believe was where then. I forgot the general name. But anyway, so let's see what we didn't have anything, artillery or nothing. Air, it was just flat field we're going to have to cross. And no trees, no nothing. So anyway, he said, well, I believe that's right. Let's just get security out and see what happens. So about that time, I saw this scout car come in with 4 or 5 motorcycles with it. And there was a general in it. And he passed where I was, and then Colonel Wells went down to see what's happening. So I came back a little bit and said, General Walker, this little Walker, not the tall guy. There was 2 General Walkers. I can't remember the first name, but he was a little short fella, about my size. Anyway, he said, General Walker wants you to get your tanks and go on in the luggage shop. I said, well, Colonel, we've talked about it, and we know where 10 of those 88 guns are down there, and it's a suicide deal. we need some artillery or something. So I agree with you. So we went back down there and talked to General. General came back for about 5 minutes. So General Walker said, "You get your tanks on the road and get on over there, and he don't give a damn if you lose all of them." That's just the words he said. And I said, "Well, okay. That's what the general said. I guess we'll have to try it." So I got I was coming to command, and then I was a captain. And I got my platoon leaders in a little room there in the house. Told them what the deal was. They had all seen just what I'd seen. Said, "Well, I don't think we can do that." And I said, "Well, we got orders to do it." And I told one of the platoon leaders to take his tanks out first. There was a roadblock just around this corner, and we knocked down, there were big old steel spikes, and we'd gotten the tanks through that. So anyway, this lieutenant said, after I said, "You take your platoon and you go first, and I'll be right behind you, and we'll have the rest of them coming in behind." And he said, "I don't want to go." And I said, "Well," I said to myself, "Well, I've heard of him." Now what are you going to do? So I hope the guys that were there will remember that. I do. But anyway, I said, "Well, Lieutenant, if you feel that way about it," we were then sitting on a bed, as I recall, on some chairs. "So why don't you just stay right in this room? Because I don't want you to get hurt. And I'll take you up to him." And he thought he thought for a little bit, and he said, "No, okay, I'll go." So we said, "Okay, let's go." So we took off, and those Germans let us get about 4 tanks through that roadblock, and they started. They wanted us again. They knocked out one tank. I think we had one guy killed. I don't know. I had several of them hurt. In the meantime, I'd seen that General Walker leave, and I got with Colonel Wells, and I said, he probably won't remember this conversation as I do, but he may be more right than I am. But anyways, I recall it. We talked it over, and we said, "No, this is not the way to win a war." So we got everybody back in the town and put up security and took care of the wounded, and he went to see the general who was over us. I don't want to say Patch, but that's not right. But anyway, when they got together,
Roderick Allen.
No, he was a division commander. That was combat. I can't remember his name, but anyway, it wasn't very long before, and he said, "You just hang tight where you are."
Your mic just came off there.
So we got in position we wanted to be in, and it wasn't very long before he came back, and the general he went to see his immediate commander said, "Did you just hold on to what you got, and we'll see what happens. We're going to go through the division and see what happens. We need some artillery in here. We probably need some air bombing and stuff like that. And we don't have any infantry with us. We just got one little battalion of infantry." And anyway, to make a long story shorter, I think it was 5 days. They had 3 battalions of artillery and 2 infantry regiments, plus the rest of our tanks in our division, in our battalion. And they fought for I think it was about 5 days before we ever got into that town. And when we got in there, we found 37 of those uh, mounted stationary 88s. Those 88s could shoot through a hole in anything we had from front to back. I saw when I was first going over there, most afraid I ever got was as we were going up to the front lines through France, we'd pass American tanks that were burned all up. And we'd been in the maintenance section and come along behind and stop and look at them. And they'd have the holes, 88 millimeter holes right through those tanks from one end to the other. They'd go through the ammunition boxes and gasoline tanks, because that's why they set on fire. And I said, man, I thought these tanks would protect you. But they don't protect against that 88. But anyway, we finally got in there, and that's what we had. And we had artillery and a couple of regiments of infantry. And I don't remember what all, but it was a bunch. And there was a priest. They read about where they drop artillery, you know, and the infantry moves in behind it, and it moves out like that, right on in. That's the way we could sit down and watch that take place. But we finally got the Americans, or Allies, finally got charge of that town, and that I pretty well cleared out the east side, the west side of the Rhine River. And shortly after that, they got a pontoon bridge across the Rhine, about somewhere along about Worm, Germany, and everybody went across that. And I think it was about 4 or 5 days later I got wounded and I went back to the hospital, and my war was over.
What about Herlesheim? I don't want to stop without us taking a look at that. What do you remember about the activity before you go in? Did you hear anything in terms of intelligence and that kind of thing? Brief us on that.
Well, the intelligence we had was, and we were kept informed every day. We was for some time, I don't remember, it's a week or 10 days before we went into combat, we were briefed on what was taking place and what we probably would do. And the company commander would call us in, and he'd tell us what he'd been to a meeting, and they say, well, now, this is where the Germans are, and this is woods, and this is town, and so forth, and tell us exactly where everything was and what we expected. And we'd always say, well, you know, if we got to go, we believe this is the right way to go. And, you know, this tanks go here and everything there and so forth and so on. But we didn't just sit there and twiddle our thumbs. We thought about this every day. And what we thought was happening was that the Battle of the Bulge had pushed them back up there, and the Germans were coming, would be up the river, but south. And they come in across in the Herlesheim area, and they had established a pretty good beachhead, we called it. And they got a lot of equipment across the river on that side we were on. So, but they would tell us every day what was going on and what could happen and where we could. And to make a long story short, then we did have some G2 information. We got the orders one night. As I recall, we'd have to travel all night long. And the orders we got, we had three choices or three possibilities of attack we were going to make. In our opinion, our officers, that they chose the worst possible attack route. They just sent everybody right out in the broad front. Across the field, there was frozen solid with ice and snow. And there was a patch of woods on one side and some more woods on another side of this field. they did send some troops over in this field because one of my I wasn't company commander yet, but one of the platoon leaders was sent with some infantry in these woods over this side, but the rest of them and the other 3 companies in the battalion were sent out across this field. The other maintenance officers, myself, were told to stay back and get ammunition replacement and food, water, and gasoline and so forth, and be prepared to come in after dark and bring it to them. Now, the way we found that out, we went out there in the middle of this field that afternoon about 2 or 3 o'clock, and we saw our tanks, all the companies, stretched out across this field. And as we were getting to our respective companies, well, we'd see one that he'd get hit up here and he'd blow up in smoke. And maybe there's one be over here in a little bit. And there was quite a number of those tanks were knocked out while we were out there. But we got to our company commanders and they told us what to do and where to be, and we'll be right here on a spot of ground. He said, we'll be right here. So this is the way my company said, this is where I want you to be coming. The other companies got their place and all for. So anyway, as soon as dark was upon us, why we started out. And we knew this was combat was going on all the time. We went out there in the middle of that field and we could not find a soul. So old Lieutenant Woods and Riddell, we were the 3 big tank maintenance officers. We'd get together every once in a while and they would say, well, we haven't found anybody yet. We walked all over that field and we'd get back together and we hadn't found anything. We couldn't find a soul out there in that field except the tanks that were blown up.
Just wrecked vehicles, nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
No bodies?
Well,
No one living?
No. So we all night long, we went up into what's Herderstown? One of the little towns there, and we got down under those buildings, you know, in the cellars, and we watched those German tanks going up and down the streets, you know. We still couldn't find it. Couldn't find anybody that had seen our companies. We run into some scouts, I think it was some kind of type of infantry, and they hadn't seen them. And anyway, so we just all night long we looked, never did find them. Next morning about daylight, Colonel Lobsall came on the radio, and somehow or another we found out that they had been told by somebody during the night. Now, not at the time, I don't remember now, but there was a railroad right down through there. And they were told to go across that railroad and get ready for a daylight attack the next morning, or something to that effect. And then when they did, and went over there, and then daylight the next morning, they were surrounded by Germans. And every one of them was most of them were captured. Some of them probably were killed. There was some killed in that deal, but there were several killed out there on that field that day before. But we never saw those guys again. And that's when Riddell and Woods and I inherited our respective companies, and we became company commanders that day.
You didn't have many tanks left, though.
I had 5 tanks. The next day, and Scott Hall inherited the battalion, because Novus in the bunch that was captured, and I've seen him once since I think it was about 88 or sometime. He was at the convention we had over in San Antonio, but we didn't discuss that. But the next day, Scott Hall, was promoted to battalion commander, You're trying to get something organized. So we organized. We had, I think, it was 5 tanks left. Leon Scott was over on the right side with the infantry, and he got only one of his tanks, I believe, was knocked out. The tank I was in, plus 4 more tanks, made up a platoon. And Scott, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Hall, told me to take those tanks out there and on that field closer than we were the day before. And there was some activity going on down in those woods, and we were going to go out there and see if we could eliminate that. And when we got out there, I mean, it was kind of snowy and you couldn't see anything. And we got out there and we just about stopped. And we saw a ball of fire down in the woods, and that's all we saw. And it hit the tank next to where I was. And I said, well, we can't do anything here. We can't see. So we dropped back. And as I left, I saw this guy laying on the ground, and I saw one laying up on top of this tank. And he had caught the ammunition was exploding and everything. So we got back. I've got a couple hundred yards, I guess, and got down in a kind of a trench type deal there. And of course, the battalion commander was aware of what was going on, and this tank sergeant got on my tank to get back to safety. And I asked him, I said, did your men get out of that tank? He said, yeah, I think so. I said, well, I know one of them did, and he's still up there on top. And I think there's one down on the ground. Did you check him out? I said, no, I didn't. I said, well, we better go check him out. So my driver and I, we went along the bushes and got up to that tank, and sure enough, that guy was standing there, laying up there on top of that tank in the fire, and he was just gasping his last breath. So we got him off the ground so he wouldn't burn completely up. But he was dead. And there was another guy. There was the gunner, I think, in a tank, or as I recall. He had a broken leg. His leg had been hit here, and his bone was sticking out of his leg. So we got him. And how that guy lived, I don't know. But my driver and I, we got him and carried him down the hedge line there. And about that time, they started shooting artillery in there on us. We was hit. I didn't know how we'd ever get out, but we would. The reason I say I don't know how he stood it. We'd throw him in a hole with those shells to get, and kind of opened up a hole. Mm-hmm. And when they started showering his skin, we just kind of threw him in those holes and get in there with him. And when it would die down, we'd take off again. Well, we finally got back. The medics jeep had gotten quite a ways out there. We got to where they were, and they loaded him up on a stretcher and took him out.
You ever find out who he was?
Oh yeah, he was a guy named gosh, I can't remember. There was 3 guys. The one that did was named Crow. And this guy, I know who he is, but I can't remember his name. I can't remember my driver's name because he was a temporary one that he drove before that day. But I knew him, but I can't call his name right now.
Maybe you can send that when they come to you, and we'll tack it on to the tape in some way so we can identify them.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of those 2 guys' names, but I never have been able to come up.
Either one of them member of the association?
I don't recall seeing the names, but as far as I know, they were not killed in combat.
Anything else you'd like to mention before we end the interview about your combat period that you haven't gotten to talk about?
Well, of course, I was wounded, like I said, but the way I was wounded, we were moving through the area and down some roads parallel, you know, and I was going down one road, I had some going down another one, and we were pretty close together, right out of Wurzburg. Wasn't in Wurzburg, it was east of Wurzburg, just short of distance. And one of my sergeants had said, well, there's some activity and some German equipment back down to our left rear down there, and I believe they're shooting at us. But nobody's been hit yet. So about that time, a mortar shell hit the ground right in front of my tank. And a piece of that shrapnel went right through between my shoulder blade and the other bone up there. And of course I felt it, but I didn't really know what happened. And I got down in my tank. I was sticking out the top of my tank, looking through the binoculars. And my gunner said, "Yeah, you got a big hole in the back of your jacket." So I don't remember what exactly took place then, but things was happening. And I finally got to the medics, and the doctor of the med, that Shoemake, was there, and he said, "Yeah, you better go back and let them take care of that." And of course, I told Lieutenant Whippert, took over the company, and I went back to the field hospital, you know, in an ambulance. Let's see, the ambulance took us somewhere, and then they got it in one of those C-3 planes, and then they took it back to field hospital. And they operated on me about midnight one night in one of those tin hospitals, like on MASH, and took out a piece of shrapnel about the big of my knuckle.
Did you get to keep that?
Yeah, I still got it. But that thing sure gave me trouble. It didn't make a very big hole, but they cut another hole up here to get it out, and that thing got infected. And I ended up with a hole about a couple inches right on top of this shoulder blade. But it never has bothered me much.
So that was the end of the war for you?
Yeah. Well, no. From the field hospital, they took me to a hospital in Paris, which was great. And I spent 2 or 3 weeks there, and they decided to close that hospital up. Now, all I had was a wounded shoulder. When they took that thing out, they they just left it open, let it drain, they bandaged it up good. And anyway, I got in that hospital in Paris about a week, and they sewed it up. And bandaged my shoulder up a little bit. And then come back in about a week, and that sucker had gotten infected, and all stitches pulled out. So I don't know whether it made the doctor mad or what happened, because they said, well, it's not going to come out this time. So they took my arm like that and took that 4-inch tape. No, nothing on top of it, just right on the skin, and wound that tape from here up across here, and said, that'll hold you. In about a week or 10 days after that, they closed that hospital up in Paris because of war. I think the war was over by then, close to it, you know. Well, yeah, I guess it was, because I was in that hospital when Roosevelt died, and when the war was over. Anyway, they sent me to England, to a hospital over there. And other guys were going home. We took them home, you know, but they think I was hurt bad enough to go home. And I went to that hospital in England, and it was nice, And when I got in that hospital, the doctor and the nurse said, "What in the world happened to you?" And I said, "I don't know. I just got a wound in my shoulder." I said, "Well, what in the world did they do this?" I don't know. They did that. They didn't ask me. They just did it. So anyway, got hold of that tape and pulled it off, and they took all the hair off my course. And anyway, it had pulled out and got infected again. This wound had. So and all this time I was taking a shot of penicillin every 4 hours. Seemed like my arm was just every time it punched, blood was squirting out. But anyway, they gave me some more medicine and said, "Well, we'll wait a few days and then we'll sew it up." So then they sewed it up. There was a lieutenant colonel that sewed it up, and he said, "I guarantee you that it will not pull out again if I sew it up." So he did. He sewed it up with some metal, just sutures. And he never did come out anymore. And then he said, "We're not going to tie you up. You don't need to be tied up." So it wasn't very long before he got well. And then I had to go back across the bay to the Army occupation. And that's where I got back to life in July. And I stayed there till November, and that's when I came home. Got home Christmas Day in 1945.
And home was where?
Abilene.
Came back to Abilene.
Mm-hmm. And I had a daughter, a year old. Then I hadn't seen yet.
What was her name? What was her name? The daughter's
Sandra. Sandra Kay. But she was a sweet little thing.
Well, thank you very much for the interview. This concludes the tape.
Well, I've enjoyed visiting. I haven't visited like this about the war since I got out of the war.
You were talking about one other experience we wanted to make sure we got on the tape.
Okay, well, from the time of the Herlisheim area experience till we were ready for combat, we took a lot of training, as I've said before, and we got new equipment and so forth. But one thing I think might be of interest is we got some new ammunition from the States. Now, to explain what significance this is, let me say this. The 76 millimeter shells that we were using had a muzzle velocity, as I recall, of about 2,900 feet per second, which could not penetrate the enemy equipment. We got this new ammunition, and it was supposed to be the thing that would do what we needed done. And the muzzle velocity on it was 4,200 feet per second, which was about close to a 50% increase in muzzle velocity. So we chance to check it out. And we had a Mark V German tank and an open field to check it out in. And we parked that tank out there, and then we drove up one of our tanks 1,000 yards away and fired at that tank. And went up to see what happened. And we found a little nick in the front of the German tank. And like you'd take a ball-peen hammer and hit it, and it just bounced off. So we moved up to 500 yards and fired again, and went up to check, and it gouged out a little more metal. Now, keep in mind the front of those German Mark V tanks, the Mark VI was worth yet, but the Mark V had about 5 or 6 inches of armor plate in front. And in order to get inside of that tank through the front, you had to shoot through that armor plate. Now, we could hit them from the sides or the back and penetrate okay, because they didn't have much armor, but this was what we were looking at. And anyway, we only got a little bit of gouge of metal out at 500 yards, so we moved up to 200 yards and fired, hit him point blank, and the projectile landed in the front of the tank, but it didn't go through. So we said, well, we're not much better off yet than we were. But anyway, we went ahead and finished the war with that. Better tanks were were made and shipped over there, and they were there on the field when the war was over, but I didn't have any experience with those 105s, which is what the new guns were. So that's it's an experiment that we did, hoping that we would improve our ability, but it didn't help much.
Thank you very much.